We're up to begin to grab a seat and again extend a warm welcome. And we're going to continue with a time of just really seeking to hear what God might have to say to us, as we always do, but particularly as we conclude a series that we launched some weeks ago entitled The Deconstruction Zone, Navigating Our Doubts and Our Difficulties. And at the heart of that is recognizing that at some level it's a part of just our human journey in which we can all come through a phase in which maybe consciously or even sometimes unconsciously we're dealing with this. What do we do when what we believe to be true and good isn't so clear? And that is something that can be particularly sensitive when someone who might have grown up believing some things, being raised with the truths of what God has said to them and shaped in them, suddenly launches into a world in which questions are coming at them and they're really challenged in terms of taking something that they presumed, and now they're faced with that. But we can face that at any time, but particularly recognizing that it's sensitive and there's a lot to navigate. So we began the series where I shared a few things about what are we navigating as we go through life. Because it's not merely just simply, oh, I'm just navigating this information. There's a little bit more at hand. So I had mentioned in that first week that we're navigating development from childhood, simplicity into the complexities, even mysteries that we realize are a part of the world as finite creatures when we become adults. And so sometimes some of the things that the stories we were told, the way they were told to us, were so simplistic they might sound like fairy tales. And we need to go a little deeper into realizing what really these stories are about. So that can be a part of what one navigates. Talked about navigating our individuation when one has to take what has been given to them and now they're saying, what do I believe? How do I own these kinds of beliefs? So naturally one wants to kind of make them their own, raise some questions, challenge those things. That's a part of what gets navigated as we go through life. Navigating questions and realizing that doubts are kind of new to us as we move into life. Sometimes we've never doubted things, and that doubts don't have to become an end in themselves, but can be a means to deeper belief. That we're navigating disappointments, and that can be very difficult when the things we've trusted and presume we can trust, the people, suddenly, well, we're a little disillusioned or disappointed because they didn't prove as trustworthy. And we need to learn, it's not about deconstructing the truths, but maybe more discernment in what we're trusting or who we're trusting. So that's a whole nother process that can be a part of the journey. And lastly, that we're navigating cultural influence and who is important and what should we trust. And there's so many different things around us. So all of these become a part of that process. And we do well to think about how can we help walk through life or help others walk through life navigating these things. And then part of that is that there are certain ideas that are very much a part of our current cultural thinking, and they can be those that if they're not addressed, not engaged, they can leave one kind of lost. And so we engaged over the last 4 weeks, 4 of those questions. Aren't we better off without religion? What about hypocrisy and abuse? Is Christian belief rational? Isn't Christianity homophobic? Those over the last 4 weeks. And today, concluding us engaging this, we want to add a sense of how to, some thoughts about navigating this whole journey towards faith. And I think it's important for us to realize what we're really navigating, because sometimes we think we're just navigating my idea, your idea. It's just ideas out there, and it's your opinion versus my opinion, and that's all there is to it. But actually, the reality of what we're navigating is that we're saying God has come and actually said, I am coming. This is who I am, and I will send one into the world, unlike any other, who will be an exact representation of my nature. And that when that one came, Jesus, he begins to declare that actually we are fully separated from God. And we're living in a state of separation from the source of all of our existence and living in a darkness where we don't really even know who we are. And so he is coming and declaring, this is the goodness that stands behind all reality. It is my Father. And I want to call you to that goodness. And I'm going to make a way for that. And so Jesus is standing in that position of truth towards which we then are all journeying through life towards. But it is not a matter of opinions. It's a matter of saying, you haven't even an idea of who you are. I'm declaring an entirely different reality, and I'm telling you how to live in that reality. And that truth is like gravity. It doesn't change. It is we who are moving through life towards that reality. And so as we do that, we're trying to navigate making sense of Jesus and what he's telling us about that reality. And as we do that, naturally, we're confused. I mean, we're just trying to figure that out. That's why the very term that's used for those followers, or what it means to become a follower, is a disciple. A disciple isn't one who's arrived. A disciple means, it's a word that comes from the Latin word that means a learner, a student, one who is trying to figure out how this gravity, how this other truth really fits, and how to walk towards it. And the image that God gave me as we began to think about the series, and it was very clear, was that it's a path that's wide enough to represent all that is Jesus saying, meaning it's no less wide or more wide than what he is saying. Sometimes we might make it more narrow by things we presume or press into it, but it needs to be wide enough for any life to navigate the questions they have, the things that they're trying to figure out, the way they're trying to work out their own desires inside of what Jesus is telling us. We need enough width, but we also need guideposts along the way so that we don't find ourselves merely turning off to the side of the road and finding ourselves just stuck and thinking, I don't know how to go forward. And that's, in a sense, what we are trying to present is how do we create that which is wide enough to navigate, but also has guideposts that can help us not find ourselves just stuck along the way in life. And it's with that that today we want to offer a few things that we think really are a part of God's story about how to navigate our doubts and difficulties. And both Josh Call and I, who we've been sharing in this series, this is close to our heart. These are the things that we think about as we walk through life, but also with youth, with friends, with people as they've journeyed through life. The things that can serve that process and the things that can sometimes be really tragically destructive in that process. So with that, would you invite Josh Call to share the first of those points?
How you guys doing? I was worried that Pastor Brad and I were going to have really different heights for the podium, and then I'd have to adjust it every time. So, like you said, my name is Josh Call. And over the past few weeks, Pastor Brad and I have been doing this series, this Deconstruction Zone series. And as I've been talking with friends in the last couple of weeks about how this final week was going to go, where Pastor Brad and I would be standing up here and we would be sharing the stage, I would describe it to them and say, well, how exactly is that going to work? And so for me, I think that these points that we're going to be trading off back and forth, I think of them as practical tools in the tool belt of someone who is navigating this deconstruction process, either their own deconstruction process or that of a friend, a classmate, a colleague, a child, a relative, someone you care about. So if you're here and you're sitting here and you're thinking, well, I'm not deconstructing, I'm all in, I'm rock solid, I'm not worried about this, then I want to remind you that we are right now moving into a time in our world that is increasingly post-deconstruction. Post-Christian, that these aren't people who are like fresh for the gospel, but these are people who often have an attitude around Christianity that may have some basis in truth and may have some basis outside of truth. And so as we seek to fulfill the Great Commission in our friend groups and our families and our communities, I think that these tools are useful in allowing us to engage people who maybe were raised Christian or know things about Christ but aren't Christian or are not Christian yet, or don't know what they believe with regard to the claims of Christianity. So the first tool in our tool belt to talk about this morning is to face our questions but also our hearts. See, I think that God has given human beings a mind that reflects his. It is a rational mind, a creative mind. And I think that with that comes an invitation to investigate the doubts and the questions that arise with respect to heaven and God and why we're here. And I firmly believe that there are firm, solid, sturdy answers that can help us to build up our faith as we seek after God. But what's fascinating is that two people can approach the same set of facts and walk away with wildly different perspectives on what they've seen. One person might look through a telescope and say, it is impossible that in all the vastness of the universe that there could actually be a personal God who cares about me. While somebody else looks through the same telescope and says, wow, I don't know how you could look at the vastness of the universe with all of its complexity and just impossibility and not believe in a God. And I think that distinction really comes down not to a difference of mind, but of heart. And I think that just as important as facing my questions and doubts about God head on and not shying away from them, I think just as important is facing my own internal desires and motivations. To ask myself, what answer do I want to find? Do I want to validate my doubts about Christianity and the Bible so that I can go and pursue the pleasures that might otherwise make me feel guilty? Or do I want to validate the existence of a holy and personal God to whom I am accountable for how I live my life? Because more often than not, I think that in this search, we end up finding what we're looking for. And if we miss that vital step of listening for the posture of our heart, I think we can very naturally end up finding the books and the podcast and the lectures that validate our biases rather than engaging fairly with views that support and maybe challenge our own. And so what comes out as a rational, well-articulated rebuttal of Christian beliefs often doesn't start there. Often it starts at the heart. It starts at, I don't want to believe. I don't want to live my life being accountable to God. I don't want this. And then the rational argument that comes up becomes this sword that I can use to fend off Christians who are trying to share their faith with me. In his letter to the Ephesians, the Apostle Paul said of the Gentiles, in Ephesians 4, he wrote, "They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts." Notice the order of events in this verse. He says, first, what happens is the hardening of hearts. It leads to the ignorance of God, which leads to a darkened understanding and separation from the life of God. So if you're a person who is in that deconstruction process and you're saying, well, I just want answers, man, I just want my rational intellect to be satisfied about these questions, then the Apostle Paul would tell you that if your heart is already hard, then there is no rational answer. There is no logical proof that will satisfy. And just as a final note on this point, and I'll hand it off to Pastor Brad in just a second, I think another question that I've heard that is worth asking to gauge where my heart is this. If I found out that the God of the Bible was undeniably, irrefutably real, would I give my life to him? Would I serve him? Because if the answer is no, when you ask yourself that question, then it really isn't a question of evidence or proof or anything else. It is first and foremost a matter of my heart being turned away from God so that I will not follow him no matter what the evidence or what the proof that I'm presented with is. So now Pastor Brad will come up with the next point.
So we believe that it's really important to realize that the journey, the navigating, is not merely of the mind, but also of the heart. And a second thing that can be very helpful as one navigates is this: identify what the conflict is and isn't. Whenever we have a big question or something seems like we're making a correlation between two things, like there's a problem here. Oftentimes it begins very large, and we just assume that that correlation explains everything. So there are many times where people are saying, well, I guess it's like scientific fact versus faith. Press further, and one might eventually realize that what facts are really there that really contradict. They may not be what we thought they were. And the same could be true about so many things, that if we begin by making a broad correlation, we do well to look deeper. Like, think if somebody was to look at somebody eating food, and then after they ate the food, they got sick. And so one could look at that and say, oh my gosh, eating food makes you sick. That is not going to be a good conclusion, because you'll just stop eating food. Or maybe it's a particular food, and you'll assume, as some of us have, oh, I'm never going to eat that food because I got sick or someone else got sick, because that's the general correlation. But what we need to do, what will serve us better, is to look more closely, look more carefully. What's the real connection that's there? What is the problem and what isn't the problem? And if one looks more closely, they might discover, oh, that food had bacteria. So that food had developed something that wasn't a part of the food. It was something that can develop. So what I need to do in life is not to stop eating food or stop eating that food. I need to live a life that is more careful about developing dangerous bacteria. You understand what I'm saying? And the same thing holds true as one might approach things that they are hearing as a correlation between, let's say, some aspect of Christian faith and something that seems or would appear to be negative correlation. So if we were to consider the question of, as we did, is religion bad? Well, one could really look and say there's been wars that have gone on in the name or the association with religion. Or how about coming out of 9/11 when the whole world had just watched people fly planes into a building, and how horrific it was. And in ways it seems like that just clarifies that, yes, religion is a problem. And that correlation could be the end of it, unless we take the time to look more carefully. And if we look a little more carefully, what we begin to understand is that most of those things have taken place much more rooted in just abuse of culture and control for power, wanting to control places, wanting to control power. And it's usually much more rooted in ethnic and cultural correlations that sometimes get defined also by religious beliefs behind them, but something else is really there. It's much more the way people abuse other people for the sake of having power. And this is precisely what Jesus engages, those very issues. He's confronting the fact that within people who are claiming something about religion, this is the human problem. It is about that. And when we begin to listen to him, we begin to realize he's talking about a bacteria. He's talking about something that can be infused, but it's not in the religion itself. It's not in the beliefs. It's actually the beliefs may be used to justify something that's in human nature. And that begins to allow us to look more closely and differentiate what is and isn't the real issue that we're dealing with. And then if we step back and look a little bit more widely, we might look and say, the problem isn't people eating food. How do I know that? Because a whole bunch of other people are eating food too, and they're not getting sick. In fact, it appears that food can be a good thing. Even people eating the food that I might have associated as being problematic. So that helps us to see. And the same is true when we begin to look at how is it that Jesus in particular, but we could also speak of the fact that it can be true of other religions bringing virtues into the world. But speaking of Christianity, it was Christianity that declared that every life was sacred, created by God in his image, to reflect his image. That had a profound impact. In fact, you and I wake up with the reality of thinking that everybody has some value. It's innate to them. It should be respected. That is not the way that the pagan world had understood things, and it transformed Western civilization. It was the early Christians who were the first ones to take babies left outside the city to die and to adopt them. It was so strange that they were considered to be very, very strange people that would do that. That would seem very normal to us, very beautiful, very right. It wasn't. And it challenged people's thinking, but it was because of that belief working its way into the Roman Empire. Christianity created the founding vision for hospitals and its call to care for the sick, because that's what Jesus called us to do. Instead of seeing the sick, as most of the world had, as being those who were cursed versus the healthy or those who are blessed, Jesus transformed that thinking and brought a change that is now for us something we would deeply value and hope for. Christianity provided the foundations for science, declaring that creation has been given order for us to manage. Christianity was the most powerful force in abolishing slavery, without a doubt. Christianity transformed the vision of ruling over others to that of the responsibility of governing for the good of all. And that is what brought down the challenge of dictatorships and monarchies that would rule, and people would accept the idea that they're free to rule for their behalf, and we're just their mere servants. Jesus challenged that, and it changed things. It was Christians and Christian-shaped nations, those shaped by these values, who responded to the famines across Africa. It was Christians and Christian-shaped nations who most responded to AIDS crisis that was devastating Africa, and still are those that are at the forefront of that. And in America, the majority of agencies working with refugees in this country, taking in those who are persecuted elsewhere and living out of danger and getting them out, it is Christians. The majority of agencies caring for the refugees are Christian-based. The largest proportion of social workers self-identify as Christians. Local congregations in America right now provide 130,000 alcohol recovery programs, provide 120,000 programs to help the unemployed, provide 26,000 active ministries to those living with HIV and AIDS, and provide or partner in 150,000 sites providing food for those in need, which has been rising since the pandemic. That is what it means to step back and look more widely at the impact, the significance between, as one has to compare a secular culture, a worldview that says everything is random and there is no value, to those who have been carrying out this story. And yet none of these things make the news. So one has to work to step back and realize these things, because they're not at the forefront of the news. And I'm going to add one more thing that sometimes I just got to toss in, and that is that those who are most engaged in church, it is continually found across all research, are those who live longer and report being happier than those who don't. So show up next week, because it comes down to those who are most consistent. So I say that as a pun, but the point is, step back and ask what the real facts are. What we need to do is to identify what the conflict is and isn't. Back to Josh for the next point.
All right. So, over the past few years, as I have, if you don't know me, I grew up in this church, been coming here since I was 4 years old. But over the past few years, as I have grown increasingly open about my faith among my secular non-believer friends, and especially since accepting the youth ministry role here at Westside, I've had there be a few times where friends of mine have either turned cold towards me or have cut me off altogether because of my being openly Christian. And what's interesting about that is that the hostility that I've experienced, and it's not a ton, but it's happened a few times. What's interesting is, though, that the hostility that I've experienced generally isn't associated directly with the teachings of Christ and the Bible, but rather with political beliefs that these people assume that I hold because they associate them with Christians. So that's tool number 3 in our tool belt, is don't let personal political perspectives become issues of faith. See, I find it really interesting that often people in the non-religious world will associate Christians first and foremost with a political ideology. I was talking with a buddy the other day, and he's not a believer, and he said, I don't really like that religious crowd. It breeds too many bad takes and extremism. And then I had to break it to him. I'm part of that religious crowd, dude. But looking at it from the inside, Christians can run the gamut politically. I mean, raise a hand if you're a Republican. I'm just kidding. I have dear, godly Christian friends who are openly socialist on one side, and then Gwen Call on the other side. That's my mom, if you don't know. And people aligned with either side politically can point to Jesus and the Bible as the basis for why they believe what they believe, for why they align with one political side over the other. See, the Christian on one side might say, I see that the way the Bible upholds traditional family unit and the dignity that the Bible places on human life and the emphasis on personal morality. Of course I'm going to vote for this party. While the person on the other side says, look at the special care that God shows to immigrants and to the poor and to the marginalized. Look at the way that Jesus elevates the role of women. I'm going to align with that political movement. So as believers, when we're witnessing to somebody, when we're sharing our faith with somebody and we say, this is who Jesus is, this is why you need to accept him as your savior, and also you need to accept my beliefs about Donald Trump or vaccines or whatever, then we place an unnecessary stumbling block in the way of the gospel. By the time we get to the good news about Jesus, odds are, if this person doesn't believe us on the other stuff, they've already tuned out. See, the thing is, and listen, I say that if you're my friend, you know, I'm like real in tune with politics. I've got, you know, some loyalty to my own political team or whatever. Neither party's platform is lined up with godliness. Left, right, or center. And when I place demands, well, that a real Christian needs to hold this perspective or to vote that way, not only am I invalidating the faith of every Christian who lines up on the other side, but I'm also saying to every unsaved person who's on the other side of the political fence, Christianity isn't for you. Christianity is for everyone who believes in Jesus, except for socialists, except for QAnon. See, I feel like things got really ramped up in 2020 with COVID and the lockdowns and people going stir crazy in their houses. I'm in a house of 5 people. It was a lot. On top of a really contentious election season, and we're about to be going into another election cycle, and I'm really worried about the way that things are going to escalate. And I don't mean on Fox News or MSNBC, I mean Christians. Back in 2020, I heard a Christian friend of mine, a good man, a godly man, I heard a Christian friend of mine say he didn't think Christians could be Democrats. And it made me really sad to hear him say that. To hear how this man, good man, godly man, how his heart had grown so cold to people on the other side from him. And I think that that is a warning to all of us. How easy it can become to place conformity over unity. You're only on my team. You're only on Team Jesus if you line up with me on this secondary issue. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians wrote that he had become all things to all people in order to advance the gospel, so that the saving power of Jesus would be experienced by Jews and non-Jews alike. And I don't think that that means that you can just turn around and you can slap Jesus onto whatever ideology you want and call it godly. But what I do think is that the best parts of a liberal worldview, the value of women, the care for refugees and the poor and the defenseless, that those best parts are reflective of the heart of Christ. And the best parts of a conservative worldview, the value of family and tradition and of justice and personal morality, those are reflective of the heart of Christ as well. So if I can build a bridge to someone, for the gospel through politics, like you're at a Bernie Sanders rally and you're like, hey, you know who else loves poor people? Jesus. If you can do that, awesome. But if all I can do is build a wall because I don't see eye to eye with my conservative uncle or my liberal cousin, then stay away from politics when you're talking to people about Jesus. And remember the value of unity as a body of Christ over conformity. And that'll bring me to the fourth tool in the tool belt, to value truth in love, because separation leads to unfruitful places. So, in some ways, I think it would be easier if we all just believed the same thing. Like if Pastor Brad came up next Sunday and he said, we're a conservative church or we're a liberal church, and then everybody who disagrees leaves, and then more people come who fit into that box. Because when we try to fit together in the box with people who we aren't quite lined up with on politics or our theological positions or these secondary issues, that's when we start to rub elbows with or bump elbows with each other. I had an unofficial group a couple of years back with some church friends where we would get together every couple of weeks and we would bat around these tough Bible questions. We called it Wrestling Club. And sometimes people would come in with really strong positions on opposing sides of a question. And the hardest part would be at the end of an hour, at the end of a couple hours, to be willing to walk away from the table, still disagreeing, but loving and respecting the other person. Still valuing the shared community and the shared space we had together. And I think that for help in navigating encounters like these, or as we engage others who are in our community who might be in the middle of that deconstruction process, we can look to Paul's letter to the Ephesians again. There's a few verses before the last one I put up. Paul writes, "Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become, in every respect, the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ." Now just notice the image of unity in that verse. Believers working together with our unique gifts and unique roles form the body of Christ on earth. And to just go back briefly and touch on the politics thing again, I think that maybe that's why people feel an alignment with a particular political side or the other, that it has to do with different roles that we participate in the body of Christ. That God may have given this person a real heart for justice issues and given that person a real heart for the fight for the unborn. And so I align one way and you align the other. Just a thought. But Paul uses this phrase, speaking the truth in love, to describe the way that believers ought to build one another up. And these two values, truth and love, aren't quite in opposition to each other, but I think they're in tension together. And I think that we can end up emphasizing one to the exclusion of the other. And when we do that, I think we can do real damage as we try and grow in community and in the way that we outreach to people who don't yet know God. And I think maybe the easier error, the more kind of passive error to fall on is to emphasize love at the expense of truth. I think that people like this can be wonderful people who really value inclusion and community, but then maybe there's a sin issue that comes up in somebody's life, or maybe somebody will begin to ask questions about some of the hard truths of the faith, and this person might feel the urge to back away from the truth in order not to offend, or in order to make someone not feel called out. But sin is like cancer in somebody's life. And the hard truths of the gospel about heaven and hell and salvation through Jesus alone are like medicine to a dying world. If a doctor decided that he didn't want to offend his patient, so he's not going to tell her about her cancer, that'd be a terrible doctor. The person's no longer a doctor. Or if you were to withhold medicine from somebody because, well, it tastes bad and it might make you feel sick, that's a terrible doctor. And in the same way, I think that in order to love people well, we must stand on truth. And the second error, and honestly, I'm going to keep it 100 with you guys, the error I am more susceptible to is valuing truth over love. I had a friend once argue to me that speaking the truth is love, and I totally disagreed. See, because if speaking the truth is love, then you would never be able to use the truth to hurt somebody. But often the most painful thing that somebody can say to you is something rooted in the truth. You want to hurt me? Talk about my tiny ears. But seriously, it's something that the Lord has really convicted me about in the last couple of weeks. That I'll sometimes catch myself preferring to win the argument than win the heart of the person. And I find myself sometimes having a lot less grace for other people than the Lord had for me when he was drawing me out of the worldly way that I was living 6 or 7 years ago. So whether you end up lining up with me and you're more of a truth at the expense of love person, or you're on the other side and you just say, I want community and inclusion, and maybe I won't talk about the truth, I think that both of those are wrong. I think that in order to fulfill our role of advancing the gospel of Christ and engaging with people who maybe are, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, or both feet out of Christianity, in order to do that, we have to be able to hold both of these things at once, truth and love. So now Pastor Brad will come up and he'll finish us out with the last point.
Maybe as a natural final point, following that need for truth and love to hold together, is the challenge that so many people feel when it comes to just feeling that Christianity is judgmentalism. It's just always prone towards people becoming more judgmental. And I think for a lot of people, that's just an uncomfortable state. Like, I don't know what to do with that faith that somehow always seems to be finding enemies to judge. Like, that just doesn't feel like really great news. And it kind of repels, and it kind of feels like it lacks compassion. And so people naturally say, I think I'm going to step away or move away from these beliefs because I assume that's just inherently what they are. And I want to suggest to you that what we need to embrace, what we need to maybe get in that process is this: to understand that the problem with judgmentalism is that our story is too small and we are playing the wrong part. So as one begins to feel like, you know what, I think the natural tendency is there's just all this sense of feeling like we're just judging, and it repels not only people, but it repels me. The natural tendency can be say, we just need to get rid of judgment. I just want to forget the idea of judgment, or at least lower any kind of judgment. And we find ourselves realizing that in some ways that's just not possible. There's lots of things that ultimately have to be judged. The world is judging things all the time. Did you know that? Like all the time. Like, just turn on the news and everything's about judging things. So it can't be as simple as we just need to get rid of judgment or any implication of sin. That is kind of the wrong thing. It just leaves one in kind of an emptiness. So we need to think about, well, then what is perhaps kind of wrong in the story? And I would say it's that our story is too small and we're on the wrong position. And what I mean by that is that Christians have naturally wanted to speak about their perspective on something taking place in the world. And so they begin to speak of something that is wrong going on, wrong beliefs, wrong actions in culture. But it ends up just being kind of standing and judging a particular group or people engaged in something. And that doesn't quite seem to fit, and it won't fit. Now, if people already believe certain things and they've agreed to those things, maybe it fits. But if they don't share those beliefs, it's not going to fit. Has anybody else found that, like, there's not a huge line of people lining up to be judged? Like, there's just not. It's not a great way to just say, hey, you know what? Line up. We just want to tell you that you're judged. It doesn't draw anything. Why? Because it's not good news. It is just fundamentally not good news. If you don't agree there's a problem, you don't agree there's a solution. So it is not particularly good news. The problem is our story is too small. What I mean by that is this: the story that we need to bring, the larger story that's not even a part of most people's beliefs, is that we don't live in a random world, that we live in a world in which it was created for good. that there is a good, that thing that so many people long for that's out of reach. It's actually because we believe that there is a God who created the world with a purpose for relationship. Yes, the creator of everything is personal and actually is after us. That is the beginning of the good news that we cannot miss. That's why Jesus came to tell us about my Father, and my Father has sent me. That is the beginning of good news, is there is good, that it's personal, and it's after you. And the problem is that we're separated from that. And the problem then becomes partly that we are separated from that. So when I say that the story is too small and we need to back up and see the larger story, it's not only that there is a God who is good, but then it brings us to the position of, and we're not right with him. We're not right. So the position that we're in is our own problem and how we have found what? Grace. How what we found is God has come to meet us in grace. And so we do have a story. And that story does involve in the fact that there are people who are, that we all are in sin, which really describes our own self-efforts, our self-ruling nature, and that we find ourselves there, and God met us with grace. What did Jesus say to go out into the world? A lot of times, you know what he said to people? Go out and tell them what I've done for you. What did Paul say? Paul would also say, go really and give a sense of hope by giving an answer that you found, the answer to the hope you found. Tell your story of finding grace. I was lost, but now I'm found. That's the larger story, and we have to position ourselves in it as we're the ones equally judged, and what we have found is grace. We're not on the other side of that. We're the ones who are saying, I have found that. That is why our story needs to be one that is ultimately a story of how we found grace, amazing grace. You know, it's not just a coincidence that the one song that people can enter into when there's some large public event still is Amazing Grace. But it's a declaration that I'm wretched. So it really carries that. But it's sung together. It is that larger story, and we need to help interpret it, speak into it, and what it really means. And I want to say to any who are here as we conclude, that you might find yourself in that process of saying, I don't know, I'm trying to navigate what is the story that I believe in. I want to say to you that it is Jesus who is standing ultimately in front. God said, look, I'm going to send one, and I'm going to actually tell you about him coming. So God went on record to tell us about the coming of Jesus. And when he comes, he will bring you into truth and grace. And Jesus stands as that's got an unchanging reality for us to come to terms with. And as we move towards that, the challenge that I would make for us is to realize that the story that we're called to is to understand, as Jesus said, that there is a good, that God has created the world as good, and that it is not random. Because ultimately, you're going to have to choose. Everyone has to choose that story. And I think for many younger lives in particular, they're not really even coming to terms in their souls with the idea of, wait, if it's not that story, then the story is pure randomness, no meaning whatsoever. Very few people can live that way. Very few people can really live into the reality that there is no order and no meaning. And so look back to what Jesus is saying. And he's saying the world is not merely random. The world is actually that has goodness, that has order to it. And Jesus is saying the reality is you can't get right with that, or you can't save yourself. You can't name yourself. You're going to find it very vain to keep trying to say that you're good enough, that you can somehow get out of the problem and become all that you know that you should be. You're going to have a hard time trying to just self-proclaim yourself and prove that you're worthwhile. That is not the way of Jesus. Jesus says, I've come to tell you that you've already been named by the Father. You are called to be his, and it's time to come home to that. That's our message. It's larger, and it's for all of us to respond to. So I'm going to invite us to pray together. Would you join me? Jesus, as we walk through life, we just once again place ourselves as those who have been called to follow, not simply to believe a set of things, but it's more dynamic. We're reminded in this moment that it is not merely a matter of what set of beliefs do we mentally ascribe to, but you've said follow. Follow you into the way in which you have told us there is a whole nother kingdom, a whole nother reality. And we are but learners. And right now we just stop before and we pray. Teach us to become your real students of life, truly learners, who ask questions. But we understand the true gravity that you have put before us, the reality of eternal life. For some of us, it's a reaffirmation. For some of us, it is even now understanding that we come to a place where we agree that you are, as you declared, the way, you are the truth, and that you are life. You are the way to what we long for. You are the truth that is unchanging, and you are life unending. For some of us, fresh or affirming again, we receive you. For you have come, and you have met us in grace. And that our story is not one in which it's about us just simply believing or even loving you, but it's a story that involves the fact that you first loved us. And that you're calling for our love because of what you've done. And we receive what you've done as you gave your life on the cross. You became the sacrifice that defines what is needed to meet us in all that we owe. You paid it.